I'm David Ricci. I'm a fine art photographer, and I'm thrilled to be here on Solo Creatives of the Berkshires and to have the opportunity to talk about my photography work over the last few decades, and in particular how it has culminated in the publication of my monograph, Edge, which was published in November of 2022 by Fall Line Press in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm going to show you some photographs from the book, and then in the second part of the episode I want to talk a little bit more about the process of making the book and the many decisions that go into putting a book of this sort together and bringing it to publication. Before I show you the images, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and growing up as a kid I didn't have a lot of interest in art or photography. I drew a bit, but I was terrible at it, so that sort of went by the wayside. I was more interested in basketball and baseball and hanging out with my buddies. After high school, I went to college in Troy, New York at RPI, where I got bachelor's and master's degrees in biomedical engineering. And while I was there, I didn't study any photography or art either. I'm totally self-taught. But it actually was at RPI where I developed my first interest in photography. And it was on actually the last week of graduate school, I came across an exhibition of the RPI Camera Club. And I remember walking through the show, and there wasn't any particular image that piqued my interest, but there was something about the medium itself that got me interested in this art form where you could actually make a photograph or make a picture right away. You didn't need any manual dexterity. You didn't need the ability to draw because you're drawing with light in photography. So from there, I moved on to Connecticut. I took an engineering job, and about 1 year into the job, I had saved enough money to buy my first camera, which was a little Nikon 35 millimeter film camera. This was long before the age of digital imaging. I'm going way back in time here, 4 decades. And a year later, I left my engineering job because the photography bug had really bitten. So I embarked on a cross-country trip throughout the United States and Canada, which lasted 100 days, and pretty much with the idea of teaching myself about photography. After that trip was over, I returned to the Berkshires, and I've lived here ever since. And after I came back, I started photographing a lot of different subject matter, and I also spent a lot of time studying about the history of art and the history of photography and going to exhibitions at galleries and museums. And I became aware that photography could be much more than just a way of capturing dramatic scenes, an attractive a dramatic sunset or a dramatic landscape or something like that, or wildlife photography, which I shot, which is all great stuff, but I wanted to sort of develop more of a personal vision. So we can look at the first photograph here. So this one is taken in the 1980s in Miami, Florida. It's a building or a location that was designed by the architectural firm Architectonica. And those two red poles are just decorative poles out in front, and the bottom right-hand corner, that mustard color form, is part of a gazebo. So I had framed the piece, and you can see that it's a very geometric, minimalist type of photograph, certainly influenced by 20th century painters like Mondrian. And so it has a very clean look to it, but you can count on a couple of hands the visual elements, the number of visual elements that are in the photograph, the number of rectangles and triangles and shapes. And this is another photograph from that time period. This was also in Florida at Boynton Beach. These are two handball courts side by side that was being built at the time I was there. And I had the camera set up on a tripod, and I waited for the sun to move, or the earth to move actually, so that the shadows would move into the corners, so I would get those triangles, pair of triangles on both the left and right hand side of the court. In the 1990s, I bought another camera. I bought a medium format camera, a Pentax 6x7, which gives you a larger negative. And the advantage of that is it allowed me to make much larger prints. Some of my prints are as large as 4 feet by 5 feet. And I started shooting a little differently. You can see this takes in more three-dimensional space and makes use of things near and far. And there were a couple ideas that I developed in this new project where I was photographing recreational sites throughout the United States, sports facilities, amusement parks, miniature golf courses along boardwalks. And one thing I was concerned about was making use of visual motifs, repeating shapes, colors, lines, or forms within the frame, within the picture of the camera. So in this photograph, it's kind of, there's an obvious motif, which is the circle within the circle in the foreground, and then it kind of comes off as an oval because of the camera perspective, and then the Ferris wheel circle in the background. But there's other repeating motifs, the vertical lamppost, the bench on the left, and the bench on the right. And I was photographing these scenes when there were very few or no people present, and for a couple of reasons. One is they kind of took on this eerie feel to them because you expect there to be crowds at these locations, but there's no people there. So it made it a little more, a little surreal, as I said. And the other thing is graphic elements that would be hidden by people kind of emerge from the scene. So I worked on this project over 7 or 8 years. This is another one that happens to be in Florida at Disney World. It's a Michael Graves Swan building off to the left. The only human reference here is my shadow in the foreground. So, you know, kind of the counterpart to that one I showed you with the basketball court. Here's another boy running across a shuffleboard court, and now the repeating motif are the triangles on the ground and the triangular forms from the fire truck ladders in the background. And the boy contributes a little splash of color and motion in the photograph. Over time, the images became a little bit, or progressively, I should say, more complex. And a lot of times I think of my photographs as being sort of like interlocking jigsaw puzzles. There are various sections that kind of fit together. This is along the Jersey Shore in, I think it was in Ocean City, if I remember correctly. So around this time, I started reading chaos theory and complexity theory. And in a nutshell, in complexity theory, there's this concept called the edge of chaos. And what the scientists talk about are, if you have any system and you add more and more elements to it, eventually it doesn't just become complex, but there's some new region or new area that sort of emerges from that, which is called the edge of chaos. One example they give is the development of brains, you know, evolving to the human brain, and where we now have millions or billions of neurons, and what emerges from that is thought and feeling, creativity. So the edge of chaos, just as a term, sort of became a metaphor for my work, because that's what I was trying to do. And this photograph here is kind of a culmination of that. This was shot in Ocean City, Maryland, in the 90s, and this is really where I was headed. It's an extraordinarily complex photograph, and I'm looking through a steel structure, a ride, to another structure behind that, and behind that there's objects in the background that all contribute to this very busy composition. There's actually people in this photograph, but again, they contribute, I think, to the rhythm and pattern of the photograph. In the bottom right, there's 2 baby carriages, and in the background, you can see these staff members both wearing orange and yellow colors. So this was, to me, this was the edge of chaos, because I was intentionally trying to push the limits of what was accepted in photographic composition. Now, since that time, I've done several other bodies of work making use of that edge of chaos style. This is England Brothers, a department store in Pittsfield that was demolished in the late 90s. So I'd done a series on loss, if you will, about buildings being demolished and factories being dismantled, the aftermath of natural disasters. This happens to be at the A.H. Rice Silk Mill, also in Pittsfield, which was dismantled in around 2005, 2006. And this is another image from the A.H. Rice Silk Mill. I did another project on American consumerism and materialism. We all buy all this stuff, and then it comes back into landfills or scrap metal yards. So I shot quite a bit in scrap metal heaps in the Springfield area and in upstate New York. This is actually up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And this is a print that is, when I exhibit it, it's 48 by 60 inches, 4 feet by 5 feet. So I'm just going to show a few more of these. So I've been fortunate throughout my career to have the opportunity to exhibit the work and have some of the, I think I've had over a dozen solo exhibitions, and I've had a number of pieces acquired by museums throughout the country. But in the back of my mind for all the years, actually this piece here, the repeating motif is the line. There's hundreds of thin lines of seaweed. This is taken in Newport, Rhode Island. So in the back of my mind, I always wanted to do a book. So years went by where I didn't do anything about it. This is a project in the most recent project, shooting commercial fishing boats in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Gloucester and Newport. Anyway, the impetus for making the book came a few years ago when I applied for and received a grant called the Publication Skills Grant that was offered by an online photography website called Luminous Landscape and jointly granted by a longtime photography publication called Lensworks. So I applied for and received the grant, which gave me the starting point, the seed money to go down the path of publishing a book. Now, the grant money was not for actually publication. It was to develop the skills and learn about photo books. So what did I do with the money? I did three basic things. I bought a 3-volume set on the history of the photo book, published by Martin Parr and Gary Badger. There's 3 large volumes, and went through that because photo books have become an art in itself, a medium in itself over the years. And then I did a workshop in Brooklyn with a Magnum photographer who brought in a number of other photographers who talked about how they had developed their books. And then I also hired a designer, Larry Chernikoff from Windhorse Design, to help me design a prototype, or what we refer to as a photo book dummy. I'm not going to go through a lot of photographs in this book, but this was like the preliminary version of the book, so lots and lots of photographs in here. The purpose of this was twofold. One, to shop around to publishers, okay, and if I didn't find a publisher, then I would have something that I could self-publish. And we used what's called a print-on-demand company called Blurb, which will print just a handful of copies for you. So I did use this to shop around to publishers, both in the hard copy and electronic version PDF. And, of course, got a couple dozen rejections until finally I met Bill Bowling at Fall Line Press in Atlanta, who said, yeah, let's do something with this. It probably won't be that book. It'll be something different, which it is. It's the book Edge, which, as I said, was published in November 2022. So it took a while to get to that point. There were a number of delays. The pandemic had a lot to do with that. But let me talk a little bit about the book Edge. And even before we got into the design aspects of the book, there was a number of decisions that had to be made, or a number of things to discuss, I should say. One is, how is the book going to be formatted? Is it going to be horizontal? Is it going to be vertical? What are the dimensions of the book going to be? Do we have an idea of how many photographs will be in the book? Do you have an idea of how many pages will be in the book? Will there be text? Where will the text go? And all these ideas that we kicked around. One of the takeaways I had from the workshop in Brooklyn was that if you're going to design a photo book, it's really not the best idea to do it entirely on a screen electronically. So there are a number of graphic design tools and software tools like InDesign from Adobe, which is what we used. Where you can move the pictures around on the screen, but it's really helpful to actually print out the candidates for the book, which is what I did. So I made, 150 different prints and spread them out on benches in my studio and put them on walls in my studio and lived with them for a while. So when Larry and I worked on the prototype, the book dummy, he and I would look at them. And the advantage of that is you see relationships between photographs that you might not have seen before, or at least I hadn't seen before, because there might be work from different projects that have some connection to each other, either graphically, the way the composition is formed, or in terms of the subject matter. So when we got to making Edge, unfortunately, we couldn't get together because of COVID, so I shipped all the prints down to the publisher, and he and the editor, Peter Essick, a former National Geographic and New York Times photographer, did the same thing, spread the books out, and then we went to Zoom and discussed the different ways of grouping and sequencing the photographs, and we went through several editing processes over the years. So there's a lot that goes into designing and producing a book of this sort. Of course, with any book, one of the major factors is the cover. So we had this great designer, Margot Frisse is her name, and she was involved in the production of this book along with Bill, Peter, and myself. And so Margot gave us a few examples of covers, and we liked all of them. But then we all sort of gravitated towards this one, and as Margot presented it to us, she said, this is sort of the obvious solution because the book is titled Edge, and it's kind of obvious to put the 4 letters into the 4 corners, like going to the edge. But we all really liked that one the best, and she agreed it was kind of effective. And then we went back and forth on what image to put in the center, or even, that was a decision. Where does the image go? Do you need an image? And we gravitated to this one. This is taken in the 90s. It's the underside of benches at Caesar's Palace, outdoor stadium where they had boxing matches. And what we liked about that is it sort of, brings the viewer in, or you can think of it as expanding out and pushing the letters to the edge. And then the colors. So, again, Margot came up with these great color combinations, and this is the one that we settled on. It might not be able to see it on your screen, but this is a deep blue-gray. It's not quite charcoal. There's a blue tone to it. And then the letters are what she called salmon. Of course, we had a discussion about whether or not it was wild salmon or farm-raised. Joking, of course. Anyway, so that's how we ended up with the cover, and then she used my name there. So it has a very clean look, and I really like it a lot. So when you open the book, there's a few things to notice. One is when we open books, we sort of look at the right-hand page, and on this right-hand page, we see the large, salmon field of salmon color with just a small quotation. I don't know if you can read that, but what it says is, "In chaos there is fertility," by the author Anais Nin. And that was a great way to establish the idea of chaos here. And on the other side, you see the end paper. Again, another decision that we made. This was suggested by our editor, Peter Essick. This is actually a very colorful photograph, but we made it monochromatic. And then Margot said, let's make it monochromatic in a way that matches that salmon color. And I love this. And in the back, you get to see it on 2 pages, but in the front, it just happens on 1 page. The other thing that you notice when we open the book is that the binding is a bit unusual. Okay, if you can see that. Most books that you have in your library, the block of the book, these pages here are glued to the spine. This is the spine right here. But this is what's called a Swiss binding. And the advantage of the Swiss binding is that the pages will lie flat. After the first couple of pages, the pages will lie flat. So if you have an image that spreads across 2 pages, there won't be a gutter. And you won't have any of that disruption in the gutter of the continuing the image from the left to the right page. One thing, the other decision we made about the format here, the reason we went with vertical is so that we could use the Swiss binding, because we thought there would be a lot of images that would spread across 2 pages. And since a lot of my photographs were taken on that medium format Pentax, the ratio of the 2-page open, the ratio of the height to the width was similar to the ratio of those negatives. So that's how we ended up with these particular dimensions. So after that, then you just have the title page. This one happens to be signed. So just Edge, my name, and then Fall Line Press at the bottom. And then we get into the first image. So this is, I'm going to show some of the same images that you just saw. I guess I need to hold that open there. And so this is the opening page. So in the prototype, in the book dummy, we did not open with that image. We opened with this image. Okay, and then there was a second one, and then we went to this. And then from those handball courts, we went to the other piece that I showed you of the boy running across the basketball court. This one, because I like going from the handball courts to the basketball courts. But the publisher, Bill, suggested we change that, and we all came around to his way of thinking, because the first image in the book, the first photograph, should be extremely strong and grab the viewer's interest. So we started with this guy here. A couple other things to notice is there is no text. The only text we've seen so far was the quote by Anais Nin and the title page, and even on this page there aren't even any page numbers. And then this image spreads across 2 pages and has a white border all around it. And this image, you know, as I showed before, you know, they're both kind of minimalist photographs of architectural subjects. But on this one, we, you know, didn't make it as big. We made it smaller and had a blank page on the left-hand side. So we established this sort of rhythm as you go through the book of different types of layouts with the backgrounds. And then we get into the first image of the amusement park series, which I showed you earlier. And in this case, we decided to bleed all the way to the edges, but I mean, there is no white border. Okay, so you go through the handball courts, the handball courts, and then the Architectonica building, and then boom, come up with this thing right here. So the decisions and what follows what and how to size them all and place them was a group effort. The publisher Bill makes the analogy to making a movie, okay? And this really, you know, he really impressed upon me the fact that this is a group effort. So in a film, you have a director, you have a cast, you have a crew. There's all kinds of aspects that need to come together. In a photo book, you have a photographer, you have a publisher, you have an editor, you have a printer, you have a binder, and designer. Everybody needs to be involved in developing this. And so we had several editing sessions where we talked about which image would follow which and how to lay them out. And then would put it in Margot's hands, and she would come back with some design suggestions. So I'm not going to show every photograph in the book here, but just to get to a few of them. This is one of the few pieces that has people in it. And I wanted to get to, so this is the cover photograph. Again, this is one we decided made more sense to go through a 2-page spread without any border, so it's bled to the edges. And then this is the first page where we have the salmon background. And at first, I was not real keen on the idea. This was the designer Margot's idea. And I guess it was because it didn't look right on my screen, and she described the color to me a little bit better. Now that we have a physical copy, of course, I had an advanced copy that I had to approve. I really like it now. And this happens, I think, 3 or 4 times throughout the book. We have the salmon background to the images rather than the white background. And then laying out 2 different photographs that play off each other in different sizes. And let me just flip through a few more here in the early section. I think I showed that earlier. Oh, I know what I wanted to point out here. So here's another one that's bled to the edges. So the photographs I showed earlier, there was one of the boy running across the basketball court, and then there was another one of another boy running across the shuffleboard court. That latter one did not make it into the book. It's one of my favorite photographs, but in developing the book, getting back to the analogy about making a film, I realized it's a whole different thing. It's a very different process than putting together an exhibition for a gallery or a museum. In making a photo book, it's clearly you hold it in your hands. It has a physicality to it, and you need to think about how it goes from beginning to end, and how the photographs are sequenced, and if you feel as though you've seen something before. So that particular photograph didn't make it in. There were a few that I sort of wish had made it in, but didn't. But there's others that I got to add in. And again, it's a group effort in deciding what goes in the book and what goes where. At least it was for me with working with Fall Line Press. So these I showed, and again, this guy here, the spread, and I'm going to kind of flip over here to this page here. So in my book dummy, in my prototype called Edge of Chaos, I grouped the different bodies of work pretty much chronologically, because that's made sense to me. But in this book, we didn't do chronologically. We went from the amusement park work to the commercial fishing work. And this transition, I think, works real well, because this is a whole bunch of this is an attraction at amusement park in Ohio where the kids crawl up around all these nets. And we transition to this 4-page gatefold of the commercial fishing work, which is the same type of material, very colorful nets scattered about, but in a different, very different context. And then as you go through the book, there's several other, a lot more photographs in the book. We wouldn't have time to go through it all, but I wanted to get to the end here. So this is fishing nets cast out on a pier in Newport, Rhode Island. And if you turn the next page, on the right-hand side, you have a very similar photograph. But these are seagrasses that came up on the shore in Eastham, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. So we go from that into that. And then that opens up into another gatefold of vines and trees taken in Kennedy Park in Lenox, Massachusetts. And then we have this picture here, which is kind of a coda, kind of the end of the day. There's a little Coke bottle and bottle of water on the table. And then we get into the text pages. I didn't talk much about the paper that we use, but this is a really high quality paper for reproducing photographs. And then there's my artist statement and an essay by the fabulous photographer and author Tim Davis, who teaches at Bard College. And then there's a thank you and a bunch of thumbnails so you can reference back to the images in the book. So that is the story of Edge. Again, it was just published. It's available at local Berkshire bookstores and online at falllinepress.com and soon on Amazon.com. So thank you.